He claimed a broken farmstead for a single gold coin. He expected silence. Instead, he found Mahara, an orc widow, and her young son, already rooted in that land. What happened next was the last thing he ever expected. There are three kinds of men who appear before a landkeeper at dawn, without a sword at their hip. The one who is buying something, the one who is losing something, and the one who no longer knows the difference between the two. Owen belonged to the third kind. He pressed his thumb into the wax seal on a table that smelled of tallow candles and old parchment, using a quill the landkeeper lent him because his own had split at the nib, much like so many other things over the past 18 months. The property had a hard-to-find address in a county he had never visited. 72 acres that the official record described as inhabitable with reservations, and that the landkeeper's assistant had described with less ceremony. Structure standing, roof with its own opinions, history best left unasked. 1 gold coin. It was the price of a warm meal at a roadside inn, of one night's shelter from the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your cloak. It was everything separating Owen from having nothing to his name besides a debt to a guild of advocates and a muscle memory of how to splint a broken limb on a battlefield cart. The dispute had lasted 14 months. A soldier he had tried to save. Correct method, correct timing. Everything correct, had died anyway. And the man's family had brought the matter before the Iron Seat, the travelling court that settled grievances between villages. Owen had survived the judgment, technically. But surviving something technically does not mean coming out of it whole. So, 1 gold coin, a farmstead, 72 acres of fresh start or fresh mistake. Owen rode for the better part of a day on a road that seemed to narrow as the last village disappeared behind the tree line. Winter had arrived early that year. By the first frost month, the sky already carried that old pewter colour that promises snow without the grace of delivering it soon. The trees along the roadside stood bare, arms stretched toward an indifferent sky, and Owen recognized himself in them in a way that made him stop humming the road song he hadn't realized he'd been singing. Silence is honest, at least. When the farmstead's stone entrance appeared on the left, marked by a crooked iron post and a boundary marker half swallowed by frost-bitten grass, Owen stopped his horse for a moment before turning in. He observed the house in the distance, timber darkened by time, a porch covered by a creeping vine that had decided to die with dignity, a chimney displaying a thin crack like a scar. "Inhabitable with reservations," he repeated aloud to no one. But there was smoke coming from the chimney. He would have spent more time processing that. The smoke, what it implied. The record's reservations that had suddenly acquired a human dimension. But Winter had other opinions about delays. The wind that swept the valley at that moment smelled of pine and frozen earth. And Owen, former field healer, former holder of a modest room above a smithy, former husband by force of circumstance, current owner of 1 coin's worth of land, breathed deep and entered what was his, or what he thought was his. Scarcity has its own smell. It isn't the smell of poverty. Poverty can be immaculate. It is the smell of enough, of exactly what is needed, of nothing wasted, because wasting is a luxury. The inside of the house smelled of dark bread and dried herbs. Owen stood in the doorway for an instant, too long enough for the heat of the hearth to hit him in the face like a gentle reprimand. The main room was small, but organized with an almost militant precision. Iron tools lined up on the stone shelf, a wool blanket folded over the arm of the bench with worn patches at the elbows. Children's boots arranged near the door with the same order as the adult boots beside them. Larger, leather darkened by honest use. Someone was living there. Someone was living there well. He heard quick footsteps coming from the back passage. Small ones first, and then a young orc child of about 6 or 7 turned the corner and stopped 2 meters away from him, with an expression of absolute surprise. The small orc had light olive-green skin, slightly pointed ears framing a round face, and eyes of a luminous amber that Owen had only seen before in very well-fed barn cats. He was carrying a piece of carved wood, handwork, patient, a small, unfinished fox, and gripped it tighter when he saw the stranger. "Mother," the boy said, without taking his eyes off Owen. Not as a cry for help, as a report. She appeared from the back room with a cloth in her hands, and the expression of someone who had rehearsed for this moment without knowing the exact date. Mahara, Owen would only learn the name minutes later, was tall, broad-shouldered, with an upright posture that came not from pride but from the habit of carrying weight. Her skin was deep green, a rich tone like leaves after rain, and her amber eyes were alert without being aggressive. There was a thin scar above her left eyebrow. Dark hair pinned in a simple braid from which a few strands had escaped, and she hadn't bothered to replace. She looked at him, looked at the land deed still folded in his right hand. "You are the new holder." It wasn't a question. "Owen," he said, and found his own voice strange, as if he hadn't used it in days, which was approximately true. "I took the deed last week." A silence passed between them, with the density of something being negotiated without words. The child, Torek, he would discover, continued holding the wooden fox and studying Owen with the empirical seriousness children reserve for new and potentially dangerous things. "I will gather our things," Mahara said finally, with a neutrality Owen recognized immediately. It was the voice of someone accustomed to having no options, and who had learned not to turn that into drama. "We can leave the house by tomorrow's first light." She had already turned away, and it was then, at that exact instant when she turned, with that devastating naturalness of one who leaves because she has always left, that Owen heard the wind outside carrying the first flakes of that winter's first snowfall. Making a moral decision at the dark hour, standing in the kitchen of a house you just claimed, listening to snow beat against old shutters. That is the real test of character. Not what you would say before a fire with ale in hand. What you say when you are tired and hungry and still choose. "Wait," said Owen. Mahara stopped. She didn't turn immediately. There was a half-second lapse, as if her body needed to confirm the word had actually been spoken and wasn't a product of exhaustion. Then she turned, and there was something in those amber eyes that wasn't exactly hope. It was the defensive position before hope, the space between the impulse to believe and the experience of having believed before. "There is snow coming," said Owen. An unnecessary gesture toward the shutter, where flakes were already drawing diagonals against the dark. "There is no traveling that road in snow. Not tonight, not tomorrow, probably." "We know the way," she said. Simple. Without arrogance. "With him." Owen looked at Torek, who was watching the scene with the wooden fox pressed against his chest. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. Heavier. Torek was 7 years old with eyes like molten amber, and the wind outside was deciding for all of them with the brutal democracy of weather. Owen ran a hand through his hair, a gesture he knew he made when he didn't know what to do, and said the thing that had begun forming since the moment he heard her say, "We can leave by tomorrow's first light," in that flat survivor's voice. "Stay the winter." Mahara blinked, once. "It is not charity." He got ahead of her because he had learned that was always the obstacle. "The property is falling apart. The barn is giving way on the north side. The east pasture fence has 3 downed posts, and I have no knowledge of the state of the well. I do not have the skill to mend any of this alone before spring." A pause. "But you clearly know how to keep this house standing. You probably know more about this land than any deed I was handed." "Master Aldrich taught me a great deal," she said. The name landed with the weight of explanation. Aldrich, the previous holder, the man who had allowed them to stay after she had found him, collapsed in the snow and warmed his frozen feet while he recovered. A detail Owen would only discover weeks later. "Then it is an agreement, sealed by bread and roof," said Owen. "You stay. I provide what needs to be traded for in the village. You teach me what Aldrich taught you about this land. When the thaw comes, we speak again." Torek looked at his mother. Mahara looked at Owen for a time he would not have known how to measure. "Why?" she finally asked. There was no accusation in the word. There was only the legitimate question of one who had learned that rare acts of kindness usually carry a price announced later. Owen thought about giving a practical answer, about efficiency or winter logic. But there was something in her gaze that made the easy answer impossible, like trying to deceive someone who had already seen too much to be deceived. "Because I am tired of losing things," he said. "And sending a mother and child out into the snow would be one more loss I cannot carry." She looked at him for another moment. Then, with the minimal ceremony of one who decides without announcing, "The stew is almost ready," said Mahara. "You can eat while I explain the state of the barn." It was a yes. It was the only kind of yes she knew how to give. Practical, direct, disguised as information. Torek somehow already knew. He placed the wooden fox on the table with a small click and went to get a third bowl. Nobody builds trust with words. Words are too cheap, too light. The wind carries them away. Trust is built with the weight of a raised beam, with the smell of sawdust on a cold afternoon, with the silent repetition of showing up. The barn took 12 days. Owen had traded 2 silver coins with a carpenter from Dunvale for the structural timber. He wasn't proud enough to ignore what he didn't know, but had insisted on working alongside, learning as he went. His hands woke with blisters in the first days, then with calluses. There was a satisfaction in the calluses he hadn't felt in anything for the past 2 years. Mahara would sometimes appear in the late afternoon, Torek behind her, to assess the progress. She didn't make unnecessary comments. When there was a miscalculation in the angle of a beam, she simply pointed with her chin and said, "That will give under-accumulated snow." And she was right, and Owen undid and redid it, and the correction never came with judgment. In return, she began appearing at the morning meal with bread. The first day was a surprise. A dark loaf on the board when he came downstairs at first light. The second day, too. By the third, there was butter she had churned herself, and a small clay pot of wild berry preserve that Torek had gathered before the snow closed everything off. Owen ate on the front step, looking out at the still-covered pasture, and felt, for the first time in a long time, that he existed inside a place, rather than merely passing through it. The words between them were short, precise, full of productive silence. "What was your trade?" she asked one afternoon when they were mending the fence on the east pasture, she holding the post while he packed the frozen earth. "Field healer, 12 years riding with a garrison." A pause, the dull sound of the post maul. "Why did you stop?" He could have evaded. But there was something in the way she asked, without idle curiosity, only real interest like someone mapping terrain, that made evasion feel wrong. "A soldier died. I did everything right." Another blow. His family brought the matter before the Iron Seat anyway. It took a year and a half, and when it was over I was cleared, but could no longer look at a healer's satchel without a silence weighing on my soul. Mahara didn't say how unfair or how cruel. She said, "The body remembers the things the mind tries to forget," and kept holding the post. Torek, during that period, had adopted Owen with the pragmatic efficiency of children who decide someone is trustworthy. There was no formal announcement, simply one morning. The small orc appeared in the workshop corner of the barn and sat on an upturned crate 2 meters from Owen, and stayed there carving his wooden fox in silence. Owen kept mending the hand bellows. It was the best company he'd had in years. "Why a fox?" Owen eventually asked. "The fox knows what others don't know," Torek said, with the seriousness of 7 years applied to 100 years' wisdom, "and doesn't feel the need to tell." Owen looked at the boy for a moment. "Where did you learn that?" "From my mother." A pause in the carving. "She knows many things she doesn't say." Owen looked out the barn opening, where Mara's boots crossed the yard toward the henhouse with the punctuality of a sundial. "I know," he said, and went back to the bellows. "Winter is the only honest season. It strips away everything planted without roots. The appearances, the performative distances, the silences that disguise cowardice. What survives winter is what is real." The night the hearth fire nearly died for good was a grey Monday. Owen had spent the day in Dunvale, half a morning's ride down the frost-hardened road, trying to trade for a length of iron piping that the smithy's apprentice promised would be ready before the next market day, with the characteristic imprecision of someone who knows the customer has no alternative. He came back empty-handed, with a sack of grain and a mood that had started low and kept falling. The cold inside the house when he arrived at the dark hour was the same as outside. Mahara was in the kitchen with a rushlight, a twist of dried reed dipped in fat, trying to coax the last embers in the hearth back to life. Torek was wrapped in 2 wool blankets on the bench, bent over a hand-copied page of letters by a light that barely reached. "How long has it been out?" asked Owen, dropping his cloak and going straight for the woodpile. 3 hours. She didn't say, "Where were you?" or "What took so long?" Only the relevant information. They worked in parallel, she at the hearth, he splitting kindling with the focused urgency of someone for whom this was not inconvenience, but necessity. Because a small orc child was sitting in the cold, and that was the only fact that mattered. By the late dark hour, when the hearth had finally caught and held, Owen dragged the bench close to the fire, gathered every blanket in the house, and assembled something that, with goodwill, could be called a camp. Torek considered this a significant improvement in living conditions. They ate thick stew that Mahara had kept warm in the iron pot, with a foresight Owen only recognized as such afterward. She had anticipated the night would be long and had cooked accordingly. After the meal, with Torek falling asleep between them at the speed of children who have no anxiety about tomorrow because they haven't yet learned they should, there was a silence different from all the previous ones. Older, more comfortable. "You could have gone somewhere easier," said Owen, looking at the fire. "When Aldrich died, could have gone to a village, found work at an inn, something like that." "I could have," she agreed. There was a pause that was reflection, not evasion. But Torek had put down roots here. A light gesture toward the sleeping boy. "And I learned that a child's roots are worth more than an adult's convenience. You gave up ease for him. Every mother gives up ease for her child." She looked at him with those amber eyes in the firelight. "You gave up ease for us. That is different." "It wasn't so hard. For someone who lost as much as you did in the last 2 years, it was." She said it without accusation and without pity, like a well-observed fact. "You could have sent us away on the first night. It would have been fair, it would have been simple, it would have been within your rights as holder." Owen didn't answer immediately. A log shifted in the fire. "I remember a day," he said finally, "when we rode into a village after a skirmish, and there was a woman alone with a small child, and it was so cold the breath froze before it left your lips. And my riding companion said, 'You see to them while I see to the others.'" A pause. "I never thought of it as a choice. It seemed like the obvious thing to do." Mahara looked at him. "Sometimes," she said, "the obvious thing to do is the rarest of all." Torek turned in his sleep and murmured something inaudible. They stayed a moment looking at him. 2 people who hadn't planned to be in that room, on that night, with that fire between them. And there was something in the scene that Owen recognized too late to defend himself against. It felt like a family. Prejudice rarely announces itself. It arrives disguised as concern, as tradition, as simple curiosity, just asking. It's just that around here it isn't customary, not that I have anything against. Prejudice is cowardly enough to never say its name out loud. In the second frost month, Owen went to Dunvale for grain and found Maurice Cray. Maurice owned the trading post, sat on the village council, belonged to 3 guilds, and was the informal authority on matters that were none of his business. He was in his early 60s, wore a stained leather vest, and had the kind of smile that functions as a warning. "Heard you've got the orcs out at the Aldrich farmstead," Maurice said, weighing the grain sack with deliberate slowness. "And the woman and the boy." Mahara and Torek, yes. Owen placed 2 copper coins on the counter. The carried more content than a speech. "It's just that old Aldrich was a different case. He had a history with them, the village understood. But you're new here, people have questions." "What kind of questions?" Maurice set the grain sack down with a light thud. "The kind people have when they don't know the situation. You know how it is." Smile. "Just want you to know that if you need alternatives, local hands, people from the valley, folk here are reliable and ask no strange questions." Owen picked up the sack. "She saved the previous holder's life in a blizzard," he said. "Stayed with him through a fever for 3 days while the road was buried." A short, deliberate pause. "If someone from this village had done the same, the old man wouldn't have had to part with his land for a single coin." He left without waiting for the next, But Dunvale's questions had long legs. The following week, 2 men appeared at the Farmstead entrance, not at the gate, just stopped at the side of the road with horses standing, and stayed there long enough for Mahara to see them from the kitchen shutter. She said nothing, but Torek asked, "Who are those men, Mother?" in a voice that shouldn't have carried that tone of familiarity with threat, not at 7 years old. Owen rode to speak with the village reeve, who listened with the kind of attention that means he would file it away and forget. He came back and found Mahara mending a fence, alone, with the precise care of someone resolving the problem within reach and ignoring what wasn't. "You knew this was going to happen," he said. "It wasn't an accusation." "It always does," she said, without pausing in her work. "To some degree, at some point. And you stay." She stopped then, looked out at the field ahead, the mended fence, the new barn on the horizon, the smoke from the hearth rising from the chimney where there had been a crack that Owen had filled with river clay in the first week. "Torek planted a seed here in the harvest month." Her voice was quiet. "Before you arrived, he said it was to see if the land was good." A pause. "I cannot abandon the land where my son planted a seed." Owen looked at her for a long moment, then he went to get the other coil of fence wire and began working beside her without another word. "Every property carries history, not the history that is in the deeds. That is only the version someone decided to record. The real history is in the land, in the old plough furrows, in the tool marks on the beams, in the names that appear on no parchment but still exist, in the way the light falls over the pasture at the 5th bell. The Aldrich farmstead cost 1 gold coin because it had cost far more before. Owen discovered this in pieces, like someone unfolding a map that had been crumpled too many times. First one corner, then another, the lines not always connecting in obvious ways. The property had originally belonged to a family called Thorne, who had arrived in the county 3 generations back. The Thorne family had fenced off land in an area that, according to records older than the deed documents, had been shared pasture for orc families of the valley. Not by formal title, but by continuous use, by decades of planting and harvesting, by the kind of ownership that precedes land keepers and wax seals. When the Thorne family had arrived with their iron boundary posts and their concept of private land, there was conflict. The kind of conflict that official records call boundary disputes, and that those who were there called something else. Aldrich had bought the land from the Thorne family 40 years ago, without knowing, or without wanting to know, the history. But Aldrich had learned, gradually, and the weight of what he had learned had changed the way he treated the orc families of the valley. It had explained why he had let Mahara stay. It had also explained why he had parted with the land for a single coin. He didn't want to profit from ground that hadn't come to him cleanly. "He told me," said Mara, one evening in the thaw month, while teaching Owen to recognize which plants in the field were good to eat in early spring. "Before he died, he asked my forgiveness. And you gave it." "I did. He was an old man carrying too much weight and had done what he could with what he understood." She pulled a green shoot and examined it. "Forgiving does not erase what happened. It only means you choose not to carry someone else's weight on top of your own." Owen was quiet for a moment. There was something in that which sounded like words meant for him, not only about Aldrich. "The judgment I lost," he said eventually. "I carried a darkness in my chest for a long time, toward the family, toward the court, toward the whole of it. And now? Now I am tired of carrying it." A pause. "I am not certain if that is forgiving or simply exhaustion." "In the beginning they feel the same," she said. "The difference shows up later, in what you do with the space the darkness leaves behind." Torek came running across the field with urgent news that turned out to be the discovery of an empty bird's nest, urgency appropriate for 7 years. And the moment passed into the kind of grateful interruption children provide when adults are getting too close to something important. But Owen spent the rest of the day thinking about the phrase, what you do with the space the darkness leaves behind. He looked at the farmstead, the repaired barn, the new fence, Mahara's garden beginning to show the first greens of the thaw, the bench he had placed near the hall window so Torek could carve in good light, and realized there was a possible answer to that question. You plant something in it. True gratitude does not announce itself. It appears in the form of action, of decision, the kind of gesture that changes the shape of a situation without asking for permission or applause. True gratitude is irrevocable. The sealed letter arrived in the second week of the planting month. Owen was in the pasture when Torek came running with it. The post rider had left it at the boundary marker, which had finally been straightened and reset by Torek as his early Thor project. The boy had the seriousness of someone delivering something important, and Owen wiped his hands on his breeches before breaking the seal. It was from a land scribe in Ironhaven. It took 3 readings to fully understand. Then he sat on the fence and read a 4th time. In the frost month, before the snow closed the road, and before Owen appeared with his 1-coin deed, Mahara had travelled to Ironhaven, a day and a half on foot and by the charity of passing carts, with Torek on her back part of the way, to consult a land scribe about the ownership rights of the property, not to claim the land for herself, to find out if there was any legal shadow over whoever might buy it, given the history of the Thorn disputes. The land scribe had found irregularities in the original Thorn boundary records, irregularities that, if unresolved, could open the property to future challenges that would leave any new holder without firm ground to stand on. Mahara had paid the scribe, using the copper and silver she had set aside from her work with Aldrich, coin by coin, over years, to clear the deed. The work had taken months. It had concluded in the planting month. The letter in Owen's hands was the clean deed, irrevocable, incontestable. The land was fully his now because of her work. Owen sat on the fence for a time he couldn't measure. The spring sun was warming the first shoots of Mahara's garden. Torek was carving at the window bench. From somewhere in the barn came the sound of Mahara, attending to some task with her usual quiet efficiency that neither announced nor expected recognition. He went inside, stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "You cleared the deed," he said. She was standing with her back to him, stirring something in the iron pot. She didn't turn immediately. There was a legal shadow over the land. It needed to be resolved. With your savings, with years of copper and silver set aside coin by coin. She turned then. There was something in those amber eyes, not quite vulnerability, but the awareness of being seen in a moment she had planned would pass without ceremony. "Aldrich let me stay when I had nowhere to go," she said. "You let us stay when you did not have to." A pause. It was the right thing to do. Mahara. "You do not need to thank me. It is a fair exchange." "It is not an exchange." His voice came out firmer than he had planned. "You used years of saved coin to protect a land that was not yours, to protect the deed of a man who had let you stay for 1 winter. That is not an exchange." He placed the letter on the table. "That is what people do for those they have chosen as kin." Silence. Torek appeared in the kitchen doorway with the wooden fox finally finished, smooth, detailed, the eyes carved with that patient attention of months, and placed it on the table beside the letter. "For you," he said to Owen, with the solemnity of someone giving a gift that cost real work. "Because you showed up." Owen looked at the fox, looked at the boy, looked at Mahara, and then did the only thing that made sense, went to get the parchment he had written with Mahara in the frost month, the winter agreement, "We speak again when the thaw comes," and tore it in half. "No more terms," he said. "You stay. Family is not the one that is born together. It is the one that decides, on a winter day or a spring day, in snow or in sun, to remain. It is the one that builds even when building is harder than leaving. Family is a verb before it is a noun." In the late planting month, the first sprout from Torek's seed emerged. It was a squash, planted in the harvest month with the irrational faith of 7 years, survived through the coldest winter in memory, appearing as a small green tongue in soil that had seemed to give up. Torek knelt in the earth for a very long time looking at it, and Owen watched from a respectful distance until the boy stood up and said, with the conviction of someone announcing a proven truth, "The land is good." "Yes," said Owen, "it is." Dunvale didn't stop having opinions. Maurice Cray kept having trading post conversations that started with, "I've got nothing against," and ended with reservations. 2 or 3 names had come off Owen's trade list after the winter, replaced by merchants in Ironhaven who didn't ask questions about who lived at the farmstead. But there was also Old Wenner, a retired herbwoman from Dunvale, who had stopped by the farmstead to see if the boy needed help with his letters, and had stayed for broth and come back the following week. There was the young horse healer from Ironhaven, who had tended one of the sick goats and left word at the boundary post for any beast in need. There were the anonymous notes of goodwill that sometimes arrived folded beneath a stone at the gate, short, unsigned, the kind of thing people do when they wish someone well, but are still afraid to attach their name. The world changed slowly, but it changed. In the long days of summer, Owen sat with Mahara on the porch after Torek had fallen asleep. The porch that had been rebuilt with new timber in the early thaw, benches made from boards left over from the barn, and said the thing that had been forming since the frost month without finding the right shape. I did not know what I was buying when I traded 1 coin for this place. Nobody knows. When they trade little for something, she said, they think they are getting the better end of the bargain. I was. She looked at him. I think this farmstead saved me, he said. Or what was in it. A pause. You and Torek. The knowing that there was something alive here that needed me to show up. Mahara was quiet for a time. In the distance, Torek's seed was growing slowly with the seriousness of things that had survived the cold. My husband died when Torek was 2, she said finally. A stone fall at the quarry works near Ironhaven. And then it was just the 2 of us. A pause. I learned not to need anyone because needing was dangerous, but Torek always needed more than I allowed. He is a good child. He is. There was a soft pride in her voice that wasn't arrogance, only recognized truth. But good children need space to be good. They need to see that the world can be good in return. Owen thought of the boy who had placed a 3rd bowl on the table that frost month night, unbidden, with the naturalness of someone who hadn't yet learned that inviting people in was dangerous. He taught me more about that than I ever taught him, said Owen. Children always teach more than they learn, said Mara. The trouble is that grown people rarely have the humility to see it. The silence that followed was the best kind, the kind that doesn't need filling because it is already full. Later, when Owen was closing up the farmstead for the night, he found the wooden fox Torek had given him placed on the hearthstone shelf by some hand that had decided it belonged there. Beside it, a small green branch, the kind Mahara placed in spots she considered part of something living. It was her way of saying, this is where we stay. It was his way of understanding, this is where I belong. It was the boy's way of confirming, this is where I planted. Blood makes you orc, pain makes you human. But choosing to build is what makes you kin.